On a morning so cold the puddles had turned to glass and your own breath froze on your scarf, two security officers dragged a homeless man out of a Philadelphia train station and put him out on the sidewalk in the frost, and 1,000 commuters streamed past and looked at their phones and did not stop. He was 68 years old. He could barely stand, and he lay there in the cold where they left him, shaking, while the city hurried past to catch its trains until one woman stopped. Her name was Denise Ford. She was on her way to a job she could not afford to be late for, a hospital cleaning job that barely covered her bills, and she had every bit as little to spare as everyone else rushing past. And she stopped anyway, because Denise Ford knew something the rest of that crowd did not, which was exactly what it feels like to be the one freezing on the ground while the world steps around you. She had been that person once. So she did not step around him. She knelt down on the frozen concrete, and she took the scarf from around her own neck, and she wrapped it around a shivering stranger. And she stayed. And in the staying, she was about to discover something that would bring her to her knees in that frost, because the broken old man she had stopped to save turned out to be the same man who, 23 years before, had stopped to save her. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens when an entire city finds out who that homeless man really was is going to stay with you a long, long time. And before we begin, do me one kindness and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It always means more than you know. The cold that morning had teeth. It was the kind of deep, dry January cold that does not blow so much as press, that gets into the seams of a coat and the soles of shoes and the marrow of anyone who has to be out in it for long, and the great old train station downtown was, as it always was on mornings like that, full of people who did not have anywhere warmer to be. That is a thing about train stations and bus terminals in cold cities that most commuters train themselves not to see, that they are, in the early hours, among the only large warm public rooms left in America where a person with nowhere to go can sit down and not immediately be told to leave. And so the unhoused come to them in the cold, to thaw, to rest, to be, for an hour, indoors and alive. And the people who run the stations know this, and they have policies about it, policies with clean bureaucratic names, and on cold mornings before the rush, those policies have a way of turning into two officers and a man being walked or carried or dragged back out into the very cold the station was the only refuge from. His name was Eugene Banks, though no one in that station knew it that morning, and he had been sitting on a bench in the warm concourse, bothering no one, his chin on his chest when the officers came. He had not been drinking. He had not been causing trouble. He was simply an old homeless man, asleep sitting up on a bench during the morning rush, which is, in the unwritten code of a busy station, a kind of offense in itself, an unsightliness, a thing certain commuters complain about and certain managers would rather not have around when the paying public is hurrying through. And so two transit security officers, one older and bored and hardened to it, one young and visibly uneasy, came and woke him and told him he could not stay. And when Eugene, stiff and slow and disoriented with cold and age, did not move fast enough, the older officer took him under the arm, more roughly than he needed to, and walked him, half stumbling, across the concourse and out through the great doors and left him on the sidewalk in the frost, the way you put out a cat and turned and went back into the warmth. The young officer had not wanted to do it. That detail matters, because this is not a story about monsters. It is a story about a machine, and about the ordinary people who run the machine and tell themselves they have no choice. He was new, and he had stood there while the older officer woke the old man, and something in him had curdled at the roughness of it, at the way you would not handle a stray dog. He had said quietly, "Maybe we just let him warm up till the rush is over," and the older officer had given him the look that veterans of every cruel system give the new ones, the look that says you'll learn, and had said, "You want to write up every complaint when the suits start calling? Policy's policy. Get the doors." And the young officer had gotten the doors, and had not met the old man's eyes, and would think about it, that small surrender for a long time afterward, the way we all think about the mornings we did the easy wrong thing because someone with more authority told us to and it was cold and we wanted our coffee. That is how it almost always goes. We imagine cruelty as a choice made by cruel people, and sometimes it is. But far more often it is a policy executed by tired people who have learned not to look too closely, a thing that happens because the form said so, and the manager said so, and the rush was coming, and everyone just wanted to get through the morning. The older officer was not a monster either. He had been doing the job 11 years, and had moved 1,000 people out of that station, and had built, the way you have to in order to survive a job like that, a wall between himself and what he was doing, and behind that wall, an old man being put out into killing cold had become simply a task, a line item the policy required and the morning demanded. He did not hate Eugene Banks. He did not see Eugene Banks at all. And that, the not seeing, was the whole of the crime, the same crime the entire hurrying crowd was about to commit, the crime this whole story exists to interrupt. And the river of commuters, of which Denise Ford was one, flowed around the whole thing the way a river flows around a stone. Because here is the truth about that crowd, and it is not a flattering one, and it includes almost all of us. They saw it. Of course they saw it. You cannot watch an old man be walked out into killing cold and not see it. But seeing and stopping are two different things, separated by a gulf that the busyness and the cold and the not my place and the someone else will, in the simple animal desire to get to work and out of the wind, all conspire to make almost impossible to cross. So they saw, and they kept walking, every one of them, hundreds of them, good people, decent people, people who would tell you sincerely that they cared, and they flowed around the old man on the ground and down into the trains and were gone. Every one of them, except Denise Ford, who got about 30 feet past him into the warmth of the concourse toward her train, before something stopped her like a hand on her chest and turned her around. If a story about the one person in the crowd who turns around is the reason you're here tonight, then make sure you're subscribed. Because what Denise Ford did when she turned around is the entire reason this story exists. She turned around because she could not do otherwise, and to understand why, you have to understand who Denise Ford was and where she had been. But in the moment, she did not think any of it. She just felt the wrongness of it land in her body, the picture of that old man on the frozen ground, and her feet stopped, and her whole life rose up in her and turned her around, and she walked back out through the great doors into the cold, against the entire current of the crowd, the one salmon swimming upstream. And she went to him. He was on the ground against the cold granite of the station wall, half sitting, half slumped, and up close he was worse than he had looked, his lips going the wrong color, his hands bare and stiff, the deep violent shivering that is the body's last alarm before it stops being able to shiver at all. And Denise Ford, who had spent 20 years cleaning a hospital and knew exactly what the cold could do to a body and how fast, understood that this was not a man being inconvenienced. This was a man who could die this morning on this sidewalk while the city went to work. And Denise did the thing she was built to do. She crouched down to his level so she was not standing over him, and she said, in the warm, steady voice you would use with someone you loved, "Hey, hey now, I've got you. You're not by yourself." And she took the scarf from around her own neck, a good thick wool scarf, the warmest thing she owned, the thing keeping her own self warm in that frost, and she wrapped it around the old man's neck and over his bare head, tucking it close, and then she took off her own gloves and worked them onto his stiff hands, and she put her arm around him and pulled him in against her so her own body heat could reach him, and she stayed, kneeling on the frozen concrete in her good work coat, holding a stranger while her train came and went without her. She did not think about the train. That is worth saying plainly, because it sounds small and is not. Denise Ford had a job she could not afford to lose, a supervisor who already watched her too closely, a write-up policy with no patience for a fourth tardy, and a stack of bills at home that did not care about her reasons. And when her train came rumbling in beneath them, and the crowd surged toward it and left, she did not so much as glance up. She had done the arithmetic in the half-second she turned around, the way the poor are always doing arithmetic, and she had decided that a man's life weighed more than a shift, and once she had decided it, she did not revisit it, because revisiting it was a luxury, and Denise Ford had never had room for luxuries. She would deal with the job later. She would deal with everything later. Right now there was a freezing man and her 2 arms and the only math that mattered, which was heat and time. So she gave him her heat. She got down on the frozen ground and put her body against the cold of him and rubbed his hands inside her gloves and kept up the low, steady stream of talk that she somehow knew, without ever having been taught, was as warming as the scarf. The talk that said, "You are not alone. Someone is here. You matter enough for someone to stop." And the crowd, some of it, began to slow. Because that is the other truth about a crowd, the hopeful one that lives right alongside the hard one. A crowd will walk past a man dying on the ground all day long. But a crowd cannot, quite, walk past the sight of one of its own kneeling down in the frost to save him. One person stopping gives the rest permission, breaks the spell of the "not my place," and within a minute or two there was a small knot of people, a young man offering his own coat, a woman calling for an ambulance, someone running back into the station to find the officers, and tell them, with considerable heat, exactly what they had done. The thing Denise Ford had done by simply turning around was not only to save one man. It was to remind a few hundred strangers, for one morning, that they had not actually wanted to be the kind of people who walk past, and that it had only ever taken one person going first to let them be something better. The ambulance came, and that was its own small battle, because Denise Ford knew exactly what would happen if she let the system simply take him. They would warm him just enough to declare him stable and then release him, hours later, back onto the same streets in the same cold, because that is what the system is built to do with a man like Eugene. Treat the symptom and discharge the person, and the cycle would begin again, and might not, next time, have a Denise in it. So she rode with him, and she stayed with him through the warming and the assessment, and she used every ounce of the authority she had learned in 20 years inside a hospital, the way you talk to medical people so they actually hear you, and when they were ready to cut him loose, she was there, signing herself as the person responsible, taking him not back to the street, but across to a warm diner, because she had decided somewhere in that ambulance that she was now, officially, in this old man's life, and was not getting out of it. She did not know his story yet. Not all of it. She only knew that she was not going to be one more person who handed Eugene Banks back to the cold, and that whatever it took to keep that from happening, she would find a way to do, the way he had once found a way for her. But all of that, the crowd, the coat, the ambulance, Denise barely registered, because she was focused entirely on the old man in her arms, talking to him, keeping him with her, and as she held him and rubbed his hands and murmured to him, the old man's shivering eased just enough that he surfaced a little, and his eyes found her face, and he tried to speak, to thank her, or to apologize, the way the chronically dismissed always apologize for the trouble of their own existence, and what he managed to get out, in a cracked whisper, the thing he had clearly said 10,000 times in his life, and said now by reflex even at the bottom of everything, was, "You didn't have to stop, baby. Nobody's nobody, though. Long as you're seen, you're somebody." And Denise Ford went absolutely still in the frost, the whole roaring station gone silent around her, because she had heard those words before. She had heard those exact words in that exact cadence one freezing night 23 years ago, when she was 19 years old and dying on a different bench in a different station, and a kind man had knelt down and said them to her. To understand what those words did to Denise Ford, kneeling in the frost, you have to know the part of her story she did not tell people, the part underneath the steady, competent hospital worker and the good mother, the part she had climbed up out of and rarely looked back down at. Because Denise Ford had not always had a job and an apartment and a daughter and a scarf to give away. Denise Ford had, at 19, been exactly the person she had just knelt down to save. She had aged out of the foster system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes and no plan and no people, the way too many kids do, dropped off the edge of a system that had never been kind to her and into a city that had no use for her, and within a year she was on the street, really on the street, sleeping in stations and shelters, and once, terribly, nowhere at all, a teenage girl alone in a cold city, learning the specific terrors that a teenage girl alone in a cold city learns. She had been proud, even then, even at the bottom, too proud to beg, and she had been slowly freezing and starving in a kind of silent dignity that the world mistook as it always does, for being fine. And on one particular night, the coldest of that winter, 19 years old and out of options and out of hope, Denise had sat on a bench in a station very much like this one, and felt the cold start to feel warm, felt the sleepiness come, and had thought, with a calm that frightened her later, that maybe she would just close her eyes, that maybe nobody would notice, that maybe it would not matter much either way. And a man had sat down next to her, a black man, then in his 40s, in a city outreach worker's jacket, with a thermos and a gentle, unhurried way about him, and he had not lectured her and he had not pitied her. He had just talked to her like she was a person and given her hot coffee from his thermos, and when he saw how she was shaking, he had taken off his own coat and put it around her shoulders, and he had said the words, "Nobody's nobody, baby. Long as you're seen, you're somebody. And right now, somebody sees you. I see you." His name had been Eugene. She had known him only as Eugene, and over the weeks that followed, he had quite simply saved her life, not with a grand gesture, but with the patient, relentless work of a man who did this for a living and did it like a calling. He got her into a real program, a good one, that he knew about, and walked her to himself. He vouched for her. He checked on her. He found her the first honest job she ever had and stood there beaming when she got her first paycheck like she was his own daughter. He had told her more than once, in that warm, certain way, that she was not disposable, that she was nobody's trash, that she had a whole life in front of her and people in it who would be glad she stayed. And slowly, because he said it enough times and clearly believed it, she had started to believe it too, and she had climbed, on the strength of a stranger's stubborn faith in her, all the way up and out into the life she had now. And then, the way it happens, she had lost track of him. She moved for the job. She got busy living the life he had given her back. She always meant to find him and thank him properly, and never did. And the years went by, 23 of them, and Eugene had faded into the most important story Denise Ford never told, the man who saved her, whose last name she had never even known. What Eugene had done for her was not one night and a coat. That was just the door. What he did was everything after, the patient, unglamorous work of actually getting a human being back on her feet, which is so much harder and so much rarer than a single dramatic kindness. He came back. That was the first astonishing thing, that the man came back, the next night and the next, with the thermos, until she trusted him enough to let him help. And then he did not let go. He knew which program would take a girl like her and not chew her up, and he did not just give her the address, he walked her there himself, and sat in the waiting room until she was seen, and came back the next week to make sure she had stayed. He found her a job, a real one, a kitchen job with a boss he knew, and he vouched for her with his own name, which was the only collateral he had, and which he spent freely on people the world had written off. He taught her the things nobody had ever taught her, how to open a bank account, how to talk to a landlord, how to fill out the forms the systems use to keep people like her out, and he did it without once making her feel like a charity case, because the genius of Eugene Banks, the thing that made him great at the work, was that he made every person he helped feel not rescued, but recognized, not pitied, but seen. And he believed in her, out loud, relentlessly, when she had no ability to believe in herself. He told her she was smart, which no one had ever told her. He told her she was going to be somebody, and he said it so plainly and so often that the words started to wear a groove in her, started to become, against all the evidence of her life, thinkable. The last time she saw him, she was 20 and had just gotten her first apartment, a tiny, terrible, wonderful place that was hers, and Eugene had come by with a cheap second-hand lamp as a housewarming gift and stood in her doorway beaming like a proud father, and he had said, "See? I told you. Nobody's nobody. You remember that, and someday you do it for somebody else." And then the job had moved her to another part of the state, and life had swallowed her, and she had never seen him again, and she had spent 23 years meaning to find the man whose last name she had never even thought to ask. And now she had, frozen, on a sidewalk, by accident, by grace, by the simple act of being unable to walk past a freezing stranger, which was, she would understand later, the most Eugene Banks thing she had ever done, And now she was kneeling in the frost, holding a freezing homeless man who had just said his words, Eugene's words, her words, the words that had pulled her back from the edge of a bench 23 years ago. And Denise Ford pulled back and looked, really looked, into the ruined frozen face of the old man in her arms, past the gray stubble in the street and the 23 years, and she found, underneath all of it, the eyes, the same gentle eyes, and she heard herself say, in a voice that did not sound like her own, Eugene? Eugene from the outreach? Oh my God, it's you. You wouldn't remember me. I was a kid. You gave me your coat, you said. You said nobody's nobody. And the old man in her arms blinked at her, confused, this stranger who knew his name and was weeping. And Denise Ford held the man who had once held her, and understood that the universe had just turned her entire life into a circle and closed it, on a frozen sidewalk on the coldest morning of the year. For a moment she could not move at all. She knelt there in the frost with her arms around him, and the whole impossible weight of it crashed over her, the odds against it, the grace of it, the unbearable symmetry, that of all the freezing people in all the stations in all the city. On the one morning she happened to turn around. It was him. It was Eugene. It was the man whose stubborn faith was the foundation under every good thing in her life, and that she had walked past him for 30 feet, that she had almost kept walking. She thought about all the mornings she had not turned around, the other freezing people she had surely passed in 23 years of commuting, and the thought was almost too much. And then she let it go, because there was no time for it, because the man who had once saved her was frostbitten and failing in her arms and needed her now, this minute, the way she had needed him once. And something in Denise Ford that had been a little bent for 23 years, the part of her that had never quite believed she deserved the life Eugene gave her, the part that had survived by keeping the homeless girl walled away, came suddenly, completely straight, because she understood she had just been handed the one thing that could heal it, which was the chance to be, for him, what he had been for her. She wiped her face, and she got businesslike, the competent hospital worker taking over from the weeping woman, and she said, Okay, Eugene, I've got you now. 23 years ago you said somebody sees you. Well, somebody sees you. It's me. And I'm not going anywhere. If your chest is tight right now, that's the story doing its work, and this is exactly the moment to subscribe, because what Denise Ford did once she knew who she was holding is the reason I had to tell you this. There is a thing this country does to its homeless that this story is really about, and it is not only the dramatic cruelty of the two officers, though that is real. It is the quieter, vaster cruelty of the policy behind them and of the crowd that walks past. We have, in city after city, made it functionally illegal to be poor in public, criminalized sitting and sleeping and existing in the warm shared spaces, designed our benches so no one can lie on them and our heated stations to expel the people most in need of heat, and we have done it not out of cartoon villainy, but out of 1,000 small institutional decisions to value the comfort of the hurrying many over the survival of the freezing few. And every winter, in the richest country in the history of the world, people freeze to death on the streets of our cities, hundreds of them, many of them old, many of them sick, almost all of them invisible, dragged from the one warm room they could find into a cold that kills. And the cruelest part, the part Denise Ford had just discovered with her arms around Eugene Banks, is that there is no them and us, that the line between the commuter and the man on the ground is so much thinner than the commuter wants to believe, that the people we step around were, so many of them, people exactly like us, who had homes and jobs and dignity, until a run of the kind of bad luck that is always closer than we think. Eugene Banks had spent his whole life on the right side of that line, reaching across it to pull people back. And then he had crossed it himself, and the city he had served had walked past him and dragged him out into the frost, and he had very nearly died of it that very morning. That was the thing Denise could not stop thinking about once she understood. The doctors told her, when they warmed him, that he had been perhaps an hour or two from the cold, doing to Eugene Banks what it does quietly to so many every winter, the slow shutdown that feels, at the end, like warmth and sleep, the same deceptive mercy that had nearly taken the 19-year-old Denise on her own bench. People do not generally freeze to death in dramatic ways. They freeze the way Eugene was freezing, sitting down, drifting off, the body's alarms worn out, in plain sight, a few feet from 1,000 hurrying people. And the records in cold cities are full of them every single year. The unhoused dead of exposure, a number we have decided, collectively, to treat as weather rather than as policy. It was not weather that put Eugene Banks on that sidewalk. Weather was only the instrument. What put him there was a policy and a crowd, and a long quiet agreement among the comfortable not to look. And the only thing that interrupted the policy and the crowd and the agreement was one woman who could not stop looking, who had been the freezing one once and could not unsee it in another. An hour later, and there would have been no story. There would only have been one more number, treated as weather, and a good wool scarf still on the neck of a woman hurrying to catch her train. Because that was the other thing Denise learned, sitting with Eugene in the warm diner across from the station where she took him once the immediate danger had passed, wrapping her hands around a coffee mug for him and getting hot food into him and refusing, absolutely refusing, to let the ambulance take him to be processed and released back onto the street, which is what would have happened. She got his story in pieces over that long morning she should have spent at work. Eugene Banks had done outreach for the city and for a string of nonprofits for nearly 30 years, had pulled God only knew how many kids and adults off the street and back into life, had been, in his prime, a quiet legend of that hard work, the man who never gave up on anybody. And then his wife, Esther, had gotten sick, and the bills had come, and Eugene had taken time off to care for her, and she had died anyway, and the grief had taken him down the way grief takes people down, and then his own health had failed, his heart, his knees, the body of a man who had spent 30 years sleeping in his car between shifts to do the work, and he could not work anymore, and the small safety net that exists for a man like him had holes in it exactly the size of a man like him, and he had fallen, slowly and then all at once, through every one of them. No children, his people gone, his savings eaten by Esther's illness, and the man who had spent his life as the one who showed up for the fallen had found, when he fell, that there was no Eugene Banks coming for Eugene Banks. He had been on the street for over a year. He had been too ashamed to go to the very programs he used to work for, the particular shame of the helper who needs help. And so he had drifted and shrunk and been dragged out of stations into the frost again and again, by a city that had completely forgotten he had ever held it together with his bare hands. Denise made him tell her the timeline gently over a second and third cup of coffee, because she needed to understand how the world could let this happen to a man like that, and the timeline was, in its way, the most damning part, because there was no single catastrophe in it, only the ordinary machinery of how a person without a cushion goes under. Esther's illness had been long and expensive, and Eugene had done what a loving husband does, spent everything, the savings, the small retirement, taken the unpaid leave. And when she died, he was 66 years old, alone, broke and broken, and the grief had knocked him flat for the better part of a year, and a man flat on his back for a year does not keep a job or an apartment. By the time he surfaced from the worst of it, the apartment was gone, and his health had collapsed. The heart and the knees and the decades of sleeping in his car between shifts all coming due at once, and he could no longer do the physical work that was the only work he had, and the thin public supports a man in his position could claim were a maze that seemed designed to exhaust people into giving up, and Eugene, exhausted already, grieving still, had not had the fight left in him to wrestle the maze. So he had fallen. And the shame, he admitted to Denise, the shame was the thing that finished it. The shame that kept him from the door. Because Eugene Banks knew exactly where the help was. He had spent 30 years being the help. He knew the programs, the shelters, the outreach teams by name, had trained half the people working them. And he simply could not, walk into one of them as a client, could not bear to be seen, broken and begging, by the world that had known him standing. The helper's shame is its own particular trap, and it had snapped shut on Eugene Banks completely, so that the man who had pulled 1,000 people in out of the cold had sat in the cold himself for over a year rather than be seen needing what he had spent his life giving, until a hospital housekeeper who knew none of that knelt down in the frost and gave it to him anyway, and would not take no, the way he had once not taken no from her. and Denise Ford sat across from him in that diner and listened to all of it and made a decision that was every bit as instinctive and as total as the decision to turn around in the first place. She was not going to let this stand. She did not have money, she did not have power, she was a hospital housekeeper who had just blown a shift she could not afford to blow. She was, on paper, the least powerful person imaginable to take on the wholesale rescue of a destitute old man. But Denise Ford had one thing. The one thing Eugene Banks had given her along with his coat 23 years ago, which was the absolute unshakable knowledge, learned from him, that nobody is nobody, that this man was not disposable, that she had been handed, by some grace she did not understand, the chance to be for him exactly what he had been for her, and she was not going to step around it. She did not know yet how. She just knew, with her whole body, that she would. It cost her the deciding. By the time she finally got to the hospital that day, hours late, having spent the morning saving a man's life on a sidewalk, her supervisor did not want to hear about any of it. And Denise Ford got the write-up, the serious one, the one that meant she was a hair from losing the job that kept her and Kira housed and fed. She drove home that night exhausted and frightened because the arithmetic of her own life had not gone anywhere. The bills were still the bills, and she had just put the whole fragile structure at risk for a stranger, and she sat in her car outside her own apartment for a few minutes and let herself feel the fear of it. And then she went inside, and her daughter Kira, 15 and sharp, took one look at her mother's face and asked what was wrong. And Denise told her all of it, the old man, the scarf, the words, the recognition. And Kira, who had grown up on the story of the nameless man who once saved her mother, sat very still and then said, "Mama, that's him. That's the coat man." And Denise said, "Yes, baby, that's him." And Kira said the only thing there was to say, the thing that settled whatever small part of Denise had still been afraid. "Well," she said, "then we have to help him." And that was that. A 15-year-old had stated the whole of it. They were going to help him, the job and the bills and the fear notwithstanding, because some debts are not optional, and because Denise Ford was raising her daughter to be exactly the kind of person who turns around, and you cannot teach that from the sidelines. This is the part of the story I most want you to stay for, so if you're not subscribed, do it now. Because what one powerless woman set loose when she refused to walk away is everything I am trying to say tonight. She started with what she had, which was a phone and a story and the truth. That first day, while she sat with Eugene, a young woman from the crowd who had stopped to help had filmed part of it, the end of it, Denise kneeling in the frost with the old man, wrapping her own scarf around him, and had posted it, the way people do, with a caption about a woman who stopped when no one else would. And it had started to travel, the way these things travel, a few thousand, then more. But Denise did not want it to be about her, the kneeling stranger, the feel-good clip. So Denise Ford did something with that small, viral moment that almost no one does. She took it over. She got the young woman to connect with her, and she added to the story the part that mattered, the part the clip did not show, which was who the old man was. She wrote it out, plainly, no drama, that the freezing man the city had dragged into the frost was Eugene Banks, that he had spent 30 years as an outreach worker pulling people off the streets of this very city, that she was one of them, that he had saved her life on a bench 23 years ago, and that she could not be the only one. "If Eugene Banks helped you," she wrote, "or someone you love all those years, find this. He needs us now. He spent his whole life making sure none of us were nobody. Let's go be somebody for him." She did not know if it would work. She was not a person with a following. She was a hospital housekeeper with a few dozen contacts and a borrowed clip. But she had learned something from Eugene a long time ago about how you reach people, which is that you tell them the truth plainly and you trust them to be better than they usually get the chance to be. And so she told the truth plainly, and she trusted, and she let it go. And she went to sit back down beside Eugene and did not expect much. What she had forgotten, what almost everyone forgets, is that the truth told plainly about a genuinely good man has a power no amount of cleverness can manufacture, that under all the noise and cruelty of the world, there is a vast and starving hunger for exactly this, for evidence that goodness is real and gets remembered and is worth something. and Denise Ford had just handed the city a story that fed that hunger straight. By the time she looked again, an hour later, it had begun to move in a way that made her catch her breath, and underneath the climbing numbers, already, the first of them were appearing. The comments that did not say what a nice story but said something else entirely, something that made the hair stand up on her arms. He saved me too. I know that man. Eugene Banks pulled me out of a worse place than that station. Where is he? How do I help? Tell me where to send money. Tell me where to come. The rescued had started to find each other, and they were not going to stop. And the city answered. It started as a trickle and became a flood, and it was, everyone who saw it agreed, one of the most extraordinary things that had happened in that city in years. Because it turned out that Eugene Banks, this anonymous old man dragged out of a station, this nobody the policy had put out like a cat, had over 30 years quietly saved a number of people that no one had ever counted, and they were out there, all over the city, all over the country now, grown up and gotten on with their lives, and Denise's post reached them, and they came. They came out of the woodwork by the dozens and then the hundreds, the runaway he had talked off a ledge, the addict he had walked to detox 40 times until the 41st one took, the veterans and the kids and the broken-down adults he had refused to give up on, and they were nurses now, and electricians and teachers and bus drivers, and a few of them were a great deal more than that, and every single one of them remembered Eugene Banks, and most of them said some version of the same thing, which was, I would be dead. I would just be dead, if not for that man. They flooded the comments. They organized. They showed up in person at the diner and then at the place Denise found for him, an outpouring of the rescued returning, decades later, to rescue their rescuer and Eugene Banks, who had spent over a year believing himself to be exactly the nobody the world had told him he was, found himself, in the space of a week, surrounded by the living proof of a life that had mattered more than almost any life in that city. They had stories, and the stories came pouring in, each one a small resurrection. There was the woman who wrote that Eugene had found her at 16, pregnant and sleeping in a stairwell, and gotten her into a program and to a doctor, and that the baby in that stairwell was now 25 and a registered nurse, and that both of them were alive because of a man with a thermos. There was the man who had been a hopeless drunk for a decade, and wrote that Eugene had driven him to detox so many times the intake staff knew Eugene's car, and had never once said a word of judgment, not on the first try and not on the 30th, and that he was 11 years sober now and had a family who had never met the man they owed everything to. There were the teachers and the bus drivers and the electricians and the home health aides, dozens and then hundreds of ordinary stable lives, every one of which had a hidden hinge in it, a cold night and a kind man who would not give up. And the thing about all those stories arriving at once was that it did something beyond sympathy for one old man. It made visible a truth that is almost always invisible, which is how much of the good in a city is carried quietly by a handful of people whose names no one knows, the outreach workers and the social workers and the teachers and the nurses and the ones who simply show up, and how completely we take that carrying for granted until one of the carriers falls, and we see, suddenly, the enormous weight they had been holding up alone. Eugene Banks had been holding up a corner of the whole city for 30 years, one frozen kid at a time, and the city had never noticed. And now, all at once, through a hospital housekeeper's refusal to walk past, it did. And a city that notices is a city that can be moved. And among the ones who came was a woman named Yolanda Pierce. Yolanda had been on the platform that very morning, as it happened, one of the hundreds who saw and almost did not stop, and she had been so shaken by watching Denise turn around, when she herself had not, that she had stood frozen with shame and then gone to work unable to think of anything else, and when Denise's post came across her feed that night with the old man's name and face, Yolanda Pierce had had to sit down, because she knew that face. 25 years before, Yolanda had been a 15-year-old runaway, and a young outreach worker named Eugene Banks had found her and not let go. And the straight line from that man's stubbornness to the successful businesswoman Yolanda Pierce had become was so clear and so total that she had built her whole life on it without ever, to her lasting shame, going back to thank him. And now, here he was, on her phone, The man who saved her, 68 and frostbitten and dragged out of a station, and Yolanda Pierce, who, unlike Denise, did have money, a great deal of it, made her own instinctive total decision, which was that she was going to spend whatever it took. Yolanda Pierce had spent 25 years being, by every external measure, a tremendous success, and carrying, the whole time, a private debt she had never found the courage to pay. She had told the story of the outreach worker who saved her in interviews, in speeches, the inspiring origin of the formidable woman she had become, and every time she told it, she had felt the small, shameful pang of knowing she had never gone back, had never even learned what became of him, had let a man who gave her everything become a useful anecdote. She had told herself he was probably retired, comfortable, fine. The idea that he might have fallen, that the safety net catches no one reliably and the helpers least of all, had never seriously occurred to her, because it is precisely the thing the comfortable are most skilled at not imagining. And so, when his face came across her screen that night, frostbitten and ruined and dragged out of a station, the debt she had been carrying for 25 years came due all at once, with interest. And Yolanda Pierce, who could move money and people in rooms the way Denise Ford could move a mop, picked up her phone and began, that very night, to move all of it toward Eugene Banks. She did not do it for credit. She asked, in fact, that her part be kept quiet, because she understood that the story belonged to Denise and to Eugene and to the hundreds, not to the one rich woman who wrote the checks, and because she knew, having learned it from Eugene himself a quarter-century before, that the help that humiliates is not help at all. What they built together, Denise Ford with her story and her stubbornness, and Yolanda Pierce with her means, and the whole rising army of the people Eugene had saved, was bigger than any of them had first imagined. The immediate things came first and fast. Eugene was gotten properly warm, properly fed, seen by real doctors who treated the frostbite and the failing heart, and moved, that very week, off the street forever, into a small, warm, decent place of his own, his bills handled quietly by people who would never miss the money and who considered it the most overdue debt of their lives. Yolanda saw to that personally and would have done 100 times more, and when Eugene, true to who he was, tried to refuse it, tried to say there were others who needed it worse, Yolanda Pierce took the old man's frostbitten hands in hers and said, "Mr. Banks, you found me on a Tuesday in the rain when I was 15, and I had decided to stop trying, and you would not let me, and I have been meaning to repay you for 25 years, and you are not, sir, going to deny me the chance now. You taught us all that nobody's nobody. Did you think that didn't include you?" And Eugene Banks, who had said those words to 1,000 freezing kids and never once let himself believe they applied to him, finally heard them said back, and broke, and let himself, for the first time in over a year, be held instead of holding. It is a strange thing to watch a man learn to receive who has only ever known how to give, and it did not come easily to Eugene Banks even then. For weeks he kept trying to turn the help away, kept pointing at others who needed it more, kept apologizing for the trouble of himself, the same apology Denise had heard him whisper in the frost, the same apology she had once made herself, the reflexive self-erasure of a person the world has taught to take up no room. And it was Denise, mostly, who broke him of it, patiently, the way he had once been patient with her, telling him over and over what he had told her, that he was not nobody, that he was allowed, that letting people love him was not a weakness, but the last hard thing he had left to learn. He learned it. Slowly, the way she had once learned to believe she was somebody, he learned to let himself be somebody's, and the learning of it, more than the apartment or the doctors or the money, was what brought Eugene Banks all the way back to life. If you've made it this far with me, here at the part that matters most, then stay. Because what they did next is the thing that turned one rescue into something that will outlive everyone in this story. Because Denise Ford, who could have stopped there, who had already done more than anyone had any right to ask, looked at the hundreds of people Eugene had saved and the resources Yolanda and the others were ready to pour out, and she thought about all the people still out there freezing in stations with no Eugene coming for them, and she said, "We cannot just save him. He would hate that. The way to honor what that man is to do what that man did." And so, out of a frozen morning and a viral clip and an army of the rescued, they built it. A real thing, a lasting thing, a center for exactly the work Eugene Banks had given his life to. Outreach to the people freezing in the stations and sleeping in the cold, the very work the city had stopped funding, now funded by the grown children of the man who used to do it alone. They named it for him, the Eugene Banks Center, over his embarrassed objections, and they staffed it with some of the very people he had saved, and they asked Denise Ford to help lead it, and Denise, who had spent 20 years cleaning a hospital and had just rediscovered on a frozen sidewalk what her whole life had quietly been preparing her for, said yes, and left the cleaning job that had nearly cost her the chance to stop that morning and went to do for a living, the thing she had done by instinct in the frost. She turned around, professionally now, every single day, and went back for the people the city walked past. The Eugene Banks Center opened in a renovated storefront not far from the station where it had all begun, and from the first day, it was unlike the cold institutional places that so often pass for help, because it was built by people who had been on the receiving end and remembered exactly how it felt. There was always coffee on, always something warm to eat, always a chair and a person who would sit down beside you and talk to you like you were a person and not a case. The staff were, many of them, the rescued, the grown Banks kids who had come pouring out of the city and then stayed to do the work, and they were extraordinary at it, because you cannot fake having been there, and they had all been there. They did the patient, unglamorous thing Eugene had taught, not just handing out the address, but walking people to the door, vouching with their own names, coming back the next night and the next. And word got around among the people who lived in the cold that there was a place near the station now where they would not move you along, where somebody would actually see you. And they came, and some of them were saved, the way Denise had been saved, the way Yolanda had been saved, one frozen person at a time. Eugene did not run it. He was too old and too tired now, his heart too weak, and he had done his 30 years. But he came in most mornings, to the chair they kept for him by the window, and he was the soul of the place, the proof of what the work was for, and the young staff would bring him his coffee and ask his advice, and the people who came in cold and ashamed would be told, gently, "That's Mr. Banks. This whole place is named for him. He started out right where you're sitting," and something in them would loosen at that, the first crack of the belief that if that warm, honored old man by the window had once been where they were, then maybe the distance back was not as impossible as the cold had been telling them it was. 1 year later, on a cold, bright morning, Eugene Banks, warm in a good coat that was his own, sat in the lobby of the center that bore his name and watched a young man come through the doors, a kid off the street, frozen and proud and silently dying the way the proud ones do. And Eugene Banks got up, slower than he used to, and got his thermos and went and sat down next to the boy and talked to him like he was a person. And after a while, when he saw how the kid was shaking, Eugene said the words, the only words, the words that had traveled from him to Denise, to Yolanda, to half the saved souls in that city, and back to him in his own hour of need, and out again, now, to one more frozen kid on one more cold morning. Nobody's nobody, son. Long as you're seen, you're somebody. And right now, he said, somebody sees you. And the whole impossible circle turned again, the way it was always going to keep turning now, because Denise Ford had refused, on one frozen morning, to be the river that flows around the stone. She still had her scarf, by the way. Eugene had kept it, that first scarf she wrapped around him in the frost, and when the center opened, he had it framed and hung it in the lobby. The good, thick wool scarf a hospital housekeeper had taken off her own neck for a stranger, and under it he put a small plate with the only words that belonged there, the ones that were the whole of everything he had ever taught and everything she had ever learned and everything the center was built to do. Somebody sees you. People who came in cold and ashamed and certain they were nobody would read it and not understand it yet, and then someone would sit down next to them with a thermos and they would begin to. It was, in the end, the most valuable thing in the building, that ordinary wool scarf, because it was the proof, hung on a wall where the freezing could see it, that one person turning around can change everything. I want to tell you something, here at the end, the way I do. When I wrote this story, I kept coming back to that crowd, the hundreds of decent people who saw an old man dragged into the frost and kept walking. Because I know that crowd, because most days, if I am honest, I am that crowd. and so are you. The terrible, ordinary truth is that it is not the cruel officers who let the Eugene Bankses of the world freeze. It is the rest of us, the good people, the ones who see and are sorry and keep walking, because we are busy, because it is cold, because it is not our place, because surely someone else. The whole world turned, in this story, on one woman crossing the 30 feet of distance between seeing and stopping. And the thing I most want you to take from it is that the distance is short, much shorter than it feels, and that you are entirely capable of crossing it. You will not always find out that the person on the ground once saved your life. Usually you will never know who they were or what they carried, but that was never the point. Eugene didn't stop for young Denise because he knew she'd grow up to save him. He stopped because she was a person freezing on a bench, and that was reason enough, and it is reason enough, and it has always been reason enough. So let me leave you with a question tonight. When was the last time you saw someone on the ground and kept walking, and wished, later, that you had turned around? And what would it take the next cold morning to be the one who stops? Tell me in the comments about a time someone stopped for you when they didn't have to. I read them, and it always means more than you know. And one real thing before I go. Because this story is gentle, but the frost in it is real, and it kills real people every single winter. If you see someone who appears to be unhoused and in danger in extreme cold, you can call 211 from almost anywhere in the United States to reach people who can connect them to warming centers, shelter, and emergency help. And in many cities, there are dedicated outreach lines and homeless services hotlines that exist for exactly that call. You do not have to fix someone's whole life to save it on a cold night. Sometimes you just have to be the one who does not walk past, who makes the call, who notices that somebody is freezing and decides that somebody is going to see them. And if you yourself are out there in the cold tonight, please hear the only thing Eugene Banks ever really had to say. You are not nobody. You never were. And there is help, and you are allowed to take it. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that the distance between seeing and stopping is shorter than it feels. Subscribe for a new story every week, and the next cold morning, when the crowd flows around someone on the ground, remember Denise Ford, and remember that it has only ever taken one person turning around. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.